and then to another slot, but now again to the original slot that was given to me. I want to speak on something which has been a rather recent study of mine, or a recent undertaking of mine, and is born through litigation or the cases that I find myself involved in nowadays. This really talks about the history of vaccines and of pharmaceutical companies. This paper was supposed to remain intact within the pandemic, but has now found itself born or discussing through the germination of pharmaceutical companies through the empires, to COVID-19 being not just a point of a reconciliation or a point of symptom, but showing that the pharmaceutical companies and colonialism is a system that ensures that the global south remains within the proverbial global south. And I just want to perhaps begin this by stating one of the few following points, that this paper, in essence, is about vaccines and the inequity of vaccines, not as market failures, but as colonial legacy embedded within the system and regime of international law. My argument in this paper and also in this presentation is that international law has reinforced pharmaceutical colonialism, and as I will show later, the TRIPS agreements and the TRIPS Plus agreements have become a visible manifestation of colonialism, but also of subjugation and of abject control. Now, in order to do this, let us remember that from the 19th century, at least for the purposes of this paper and study, that you see that pharmaceutical companies thrived on colonial extractions, and in so far as examples are concerned, one may look only as far as to the Congo and the quinine extractions over there, Wellcome and the operations in India and West Africa, and Bayer's expansion into the tropical medicines of the world. Colonized bodies were the test sites. Burroughs Wellcome's tablets in Indian prisons, Koch's exotical trials in German East Africa, places such as those as Namibia. The colonial playbook was simple: resource concessions, forced trials, segregated care, and metasize into treaty-backed exclusivities. Institute pastures, vaccines campaigns in the French region and the French colonies is also something that is important, and a place rather close to India and to where this paper is being delivered from is Kasole. Kasole is a small hill station not too far from the capital, and in 1905 the Pasteur Institute, renamed as it is now the Central Research Institute, whose Semplame anti-rabies vaccine was operationalized at a large scale in 1911 and is now common generalized medicine across India. So on one hand, one may argue about the generalization of medicines and the mass production of medicines. At first, you must understand the history of medicines, and that is the very essence of this paper. Health systems were also segregated. White-only facilities in British India, indigenous powers in North Africa, and expired vaccines were forced on villagers in Togoland, just by way of example. I'd be, of course, happy to share more details and examples as this paper progresses, and also as this conference and discussion progresses, but also in the written paper that I have for this very noble conference, and also the fascinating topics that it seeks to discuss. You also have examples of patterns being generally and geopolitically weaponized. The story of Suriname between Bayer and Rhône-Poulenc foreshadowed the TRIPS agreements and the dynamics. With this broad overlay, it is perhaps important to understand at the real renaissance of colonial practices in pharmaceutical practice or in pharmaceutical arrangements, and especially true something which this becomes particularly true in the post-war reconsideration and reconciliation period, where you see the large pharmaceutical companies like Farben being broken up, but Bayer and its successors kept the network and science intact within its clutches. You see Wellcome Trust and Rhône-Poulenc, as various examples, become suppliers to ex-colonies. US contracts, such as those by Pfizer and Merck, the giants during polio campaigns, made an absolute fortune. And in a culmination of this, by the 1980s, a handful of multinationals controlled essential drugs globally. A result of this was a 20-year patent mandatory, which was worldwide, and generic industries such as those in India and Brazil were constrained. The global flexibilities, global south flexibilities, curtailed and were left at the grasp of those controlling global trade and TRIPS agreements. TRIPS Plus, FTS, ISDS were all creating, all in all, a chilling effect on compulsory licenses across the globe. But what was the international legal structure? What were the tools at play? Were these included but were perhaps not limited to the WTO TRIPS agreement of 1994, the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health of 2001, Article 31 and its provisional clauses on compulsory licensing and exports, the International Health Regulations of 2005 on collective security, and perhaps one may also look at the General Comment 14 and the ICESR on human rights and Article 12 within it, which largely fell under the chapeau of right to health. Industry coalitions also effectively scripted TRIPS, modern patent governance, as carrying those long legends and long arms of colonialism, racism, and inequality in its very DNA. Investor-state overlays, as those which I discussed recently, such as those in the ISDS, elevated intellectual property to protected investments, chilling public health regulations, such as those in the Eli Lilly versus Canada case, and the cautionary signal in every single aspect therein. Despite billions being poured into funding for pharmaceutical giants like Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, held patents, withheld know-how, and tightly politicized and policed licenses. You see this also in the context of WHO's CTAP, which was ignored, and the mRNA hub in South Africa had to re-engineer Moderna's vaccines, especially during the time of COVID-19. AstraZeneca's quote-unquote non-profit model is still restricted by the Serum Institute markets and export controls. Pfizer and Moderna are highly prioritized, high-paying buyers such as those in the global north, thereby leading to something which became a part of our zeitgeist and is today known as the vaccine apartheid. India and South Africa's TRIPS waiver proposals gained majority during the pandemic, but were blocked by countries in the global north, such as those, but not limited to, the United States of America, to the United Kingdom, to Switzerland, and others, which finally compromised, but was too little, too late. In the face of all these atrocities, how can the global south come to any sort of conclusion or of any sort of assistance? What you see on your slides, ladies and gentlemen, friends, is conclusions, but I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the concept, the large concept of justice, on the concept of reparations. And reparations, at least to my mind, requires not just long-sounding political dialogue, but also legal action. And legal action, at least in the Indian context, comes through in the form of Novartis versus Union of India, which I am happy to and proud to say is done something by my supervisor, Mr. Gopal Subramaniam. Novartis is a case which was fought in 2013 in the Indian Supreme Court and upheld Section 3D of the Indian Patents Act, which bars patents on minor modifications of existing drugs unless they show significant greater efficacy. This struck down Novartis' attempts to patent a few new forms of leukemia drug, Gleevec, preventing, therefore, what is known in the patent industry as evergreening, strategies that extended monopolies without genuine invention. The ruling preserved India's capacity to produce affordable generics, reaffirmed TRIPS flexibilities, and set a global south precedent for prioritizing public health in over corporate patent claims. AstraZeneca's model also remained highly politicized in this regard, and is something that the Serum Institute in India was boxed by. But this example of global south litigation and, in some sense, active challenge to the hierarchical structures created is something that requires further and deeper study, and from a perspective that looks at it from a comparative lens. Waiver diplomacy shows that the fault line lies right over here. We saw this most starkly in the India-South Africa TRIPS 2020 waiver bid, which attracted over 100 supporters. But small EU-led nation blocs and consensus building was beating the lobbying of equity, compulsory licensing, practicing, and the pressures and promises were therefore the default understanding. Of course, there are other sectors and markets as well, such as those in Thailand, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, which I'd be happy to discuss and fit this model of normative baselines, which require a deeper study. But the normative baselines will be found in law and will be found in human rights instruments and our core obligations. I have, of course, reflected on these earlier, but will now add to the list and help us consider or remind ourselves of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the state's duty and the corporate responsibility towards respect of health. The IHR and 2005 solidarity obligation is also something that requires our focus. The Nagoya Protocol for benefit sharing on genetic resources and related traditional knowledge is also something which we can consider to bolster our arguments. TRIPS' one-size-fits-all patentability requires the tests and rigors of the 21st century and all that comes within it. Therefore, if we are to look at it from a structuralist perspective, we must look at the hardwiring of public health, which must override trade law principles, an ex-ante emergency clause that suspends relevant intellectual property protections for things like the WHO declared principles and regulations is something that requires our consideration. We must reinterpret the TRIPS to expand Article 30 and 31 to use and operationalize it without any frictions. We should not limit data exclusivity just to emergencies and expressly insulate competition law against pharmaceutical monopolization. We must also look at the TRIPS Plus constraints in new FTAs and carve health measures out of ISDS, where ISDS persists, adopt a public health carve-out, and shift the course to deter specific speculative claims. We must also look at the alignment of trade and finance within the health paradigms. We must target debt relief, we must focus on concession financing for vaccine manufacturing and build it out of countries such as those in the global south. Conditions and market access and preferences of technology, looking at it from a transfer of open licensing regime is the need of the hour. We must also look at the pandemic accord and the pandemic international legal principles relevant in this regard to see that there is a sharing of know-how of intellectual property and also a WHO hosted mechanism which deals with R&D transparency of subsidies, of costs and of prices. Accountability levers such as the right to health, the litigation of this domestically and the competition of enforcement against excessive pricing and exclusionary licensing is also something which we must consider. All in all, the strategic bottom line is simple and straightforward. We must decolonize vaccine governance by means of shifting from charity to voluntary licensing to legal entitlements, such as those in automatic IPO rights, enforceability of tech transfers, and regionally distributed manufacturing, so that all in all, in the next crisis, the place of birth does not determine the chance of life and survival. To conclude, I'd like to say that vaccine inequity is not accidental, but the predictable effect of a legal order rooted in empire making. International law was not or is now finding itself as the instrument entrenched in monopoly, and COVID-19 in this regard was its greatest bias and confirmation. Global South agencies are visible through litigation, through diplomacy, through technology sharing, but structural reform remains essential. A decolonized vaccine regime is not utopian, but the necessary reckoning with which international law's colonial DNA must be reshaped and taken out from the abyss. With those words, I thank the organizers once again for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts and perspective. It's been a fantastic learning curve listening to the other papers, and I remain ready for whatever questions are posed my way. Thank you.